Welcome back to the Election Year Survival Guide. So glad that you're still with us. In part one, we talked about the most common reasons churches and pastors give for not wanting to get engaged in the conversations that are happening during an election year, and more broadly than that, in the culture, and explained why they aren't particularly persuasive arguments. But here in part two, we're going to talk about why we should be confronting the culture for the sake of the gospel. And the for the sake of the gospel is really the most important part, because it's often encouraged that we need to get involved in these things in order to, own the libs or win our argument or make sure that we don't get taken over by the Rainbow Mafia or whatever kind of the alarmist tag is for that day, whatever's trending on social media. But we want to make sure that we keep the main thing, and recognize that as believers we are called to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And so in this section, we're going to recognize that these ideas that are being debated in the culture are not primarily political ideas, though that's the battlefield that a lot of them are discussed. But they are, in a much larger, much more important sense, ideas that are exalting themselves against the knowledge of God. And we know as believers, it's our job to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And so the first point we want to make in reshaping how we think about this entire arena is recognizing that we are in a religious war. Most of the time that political conversations, issues are discussed during an election year, it's framed as elephants versus donkeys, red versus blue, left versus right, Republicans versus Democrats. We are very familiar with that. That is not necessarily untrue, because we know that there are partisan differences depending on the issue, but that is a distraction for believers from asking the question, as we discussed in one of the previous lessons: does God care or does God not care? When God cares, we care. If God doesn't care, we might have practical reasons to have an opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we can apply prudence and wisdom and all of those things, but we don't need to care on the same level if this is just a practical question about what makes the most sense, rather than having it implicate what God has told us is good for humanity and what is not good for humanity. The fact that we are in a religious war has to be kept in mind, because the left-right framework, the Republican-Democrat framework, is not what is actually happening for us as believers. What we're really dealing with is this battle between truth and lies. And we know secularism and the Judeo-Christian worldview, and if we can paint with a broad brush, that describes in significant ways the political conflicts that we see. Those are not just different political parties or different political perspectives. They are ultimately competing religions that are going at war. What many would like you to believe is that this is a conflict between the religious theocrats who are trying to force everyone to live like them, and secularists who are just trying to create the space for everybody to be able to do whatever they want. But we as believers need to understand that ultimately these are competing religions, and here's some evidence for that. I want to go through seven evidences of the fact that we are really dealing with competing religions, not just competing political parties. First, both secularism and Judeo-Christianity have origin stories. We know that Genesis 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth, but secularists have their own origin story. They believe that, eons ago, there was some matter that existed, and we don't want to talk about where that matter came from because that's problematic, but it existed, it exploded, the Big Bang happened, and then eventually nothing became a single-celled organism, which became us, right? That's their story, and I make fun of it a little bit because I think it's worthy of being made fun of. But there is an origin story that answers the basic questions that all religions must, of where did we come from. But the second reason they're similar is that both secularism and Judeo-Christianity have competing explanations for the world's problems. And in fact, there's a reason for unity underlying this particular subject, because one thing that the left and the right, secularists and Christians, all agree on is the fact that there are problems. Nobody scans the landscape of the universe and says everything is as it should be. Now, why do we all recognize that there's problems? That in itself indicates a creator. And one of the problems that secularism has is, why do you have this strong moral compass, this strong sense of right and wrong, if you just came about naturally. Chickens and dogs and, anteaters, they don't have a strong moral sense of right and wrong, but you do. Why is that? And of course, Christians would say that is evidence of a creator who has written God's law on your heart. But even setting that aside, what we must recognize, and what leftists and secularists do recognize, is that they do have that sense of right and wrong. And so, but where we differ, of course, while we agree that there are problems, where we differ is the explanation for that problem. What Scripture tells us is that the problem is sin, that we have rebelled against God's law, and that sin has basically become a hereditary problem that has infected all of humanity. Secularists deny that premise. They don't believe that sin is an actual thing. In many cases, that's just a social construct designed to control people. But the explanation that they have for why everything is messed up is not sin, but it is injustice. It's systemic injustice that exists outside of us. Christians believe the biggest problems are inside of us. Secularists believe the biggest problems are outside of us. They believe that once power is taken from the people who are currently in power, who misuse it, then those of us who are good and virtuous and right, we will take the power and we will use it benevolently. And of course, we know there's lots of historical problems with that. So far, we've never found the benevolent dictator who always uses power for goodness and mercy and truth, right? So the diagnosis falls apart that way. But for our purposes now, understanding that we are in a religious war, secularists, it's not just that they have a different understanding of where those problems came from, which leads us to the third point, which is that we have competing solutions to the world's problems. So it makes sense that if we diagnose the world's problems differently, we would have a different way of treating that problem. Christians would say the problem of sin is redemption through Jesus, renewed hearts, renewed desires. As secularists would say, because the problem is injustice, the solution is revolution, which of course is a political revolution whereby we seize power from the bad people who currently have it, give it to the good people who should have it, and then suddenly injustice goes away. And we are, playing harps, dancing on clouds with unicorns. That's the hope. That's how we achieve the solution to the world's problems. But again, in the larger narrative, secularism has all of the components of religion. There is an origin story, there's a recognition that there's a problem, there's an understanding of the problem, and there's a prescription for the solution. It just happens to be different than the Christian one. In addition to that, fourth point here on why these are really competing religions is we have competing paths to meaning. Now, the Christian understanding of that is we find meaning by fulfilling the purpose that our Creator gave us. He created us to submit to Him and enjoy Him forever. That's where we find significance and satisfaction in our lives. Of course, when you deny the existence of a Creator, that's not how that happens. So how do they find a meaning? What's the story, the pursuit of meaning? Because again, whether you're a secularist or a committed theist, everybody wants to be part of something bigger than themselves, and secularists are no exception to that. So how do they find meaning? What is the story? What is the path to meaning? It's by joining the revolution that will ultimately overthrow the power that will solve the problems in the world. Their hope is not in a new heaven and a new earth. It's the utopia that will be created now once they get the power. By joining that revolution, they can get meaning and satisfaction and purpose and all of those things that ultimately we all desire. They just don't find it in serving their Creator. They find it in serving a revolution that they believe will ultimately solve the problem. The fifth reason why these are really just competing religions is because both sides, Christianity and secularism, have competing iconography. And we know what religious iconography looks like. We wear it around our necks in the form of crosses. We put them on the walls of our homes and of our churches. We have art that depicts biblical imagery, biblical scenes, biblical characters, all intended to remind us of things that are ultimately true. But of course, that's also true of secularists. They put bumper stickers on their car, Save Our Mother, with a picture of the earth, right? You have Coexist, which is a religiously laden statement about meaning and about the fact that all paths lead to God, just be nice to each other. That's what their religious convictions say, and that's what they proclaim on those kind of symbols. Pride flags are imagery that they revere, that they display as a way of communicating what they believe to be ultimately true. So, different religions to be sure, but religions nonetheless. The sixth reason we know this is because we have competing holidays. Just like we have competing iconography, Christians have Christmas and Easter, and we know the imagery conjured up by those things about the birth of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, where we celebrate those things. What is a secularist religious holiday? Well, in fact, it's an entire month. It's called Pride Month, where we celebrate the fact that we are in charge of ourselves, that we get to determine for ourselves what is right and wrong, that we get to determine for ourselves what we are. We get to be self-created beings, which of course is one of the original sins in Genesis 3. That's what the serpent was trying to convince Eve of, that you could become like God, that you can create yourself. Of course, God says, no, you can't. I have created you. That's the conflict, right? But there is an entire secular holiday dedicated to the proposition that we belong to ourselves, that we can determine what is right and wrong for ourselves, and there are many, many adherents, as we all know. And the seventh reason why we know these are fundamentally competing religions and not competing political parties is we have different creeds. Now, depending on your church tradition, you may or may not recite the Apostles' Creed in your gatherings at church, but we all know what the Apostles' Creed is, and we know why people recite it, because it's necessary in the liturgy of our lives to remind ourselves of things that are ultimately true. And it's also, in some senses, a form of evangelism. So it's discipleship of ourselves, reminders to ourselves, but also a proclamation to a world that needs to hear it. These are the things that are ultimately true about God and the one who created us, and it's important that you know those things, right? But what's the parallel to the Apostles' Creed in the secular world? Well, slogans, political slogans, things like my body, my choice. When they chant outside a legislative chamber, my body, my choice, what are they saying? They're saying that I belong to myself, that I am in control of myself, that I am self-defined, maybe even self-created, but certainly self-defined, and that no one else has the right to tell me what to do. Those are all fundamentally, that's all dogma in their secular religion that they not only believe with conviction themselves, but they expect everyone else to recognize also. All of this, of course, framed as a political debate, but in reality, we as believers need to understand that those ideas, and that secularism is fulfilling all of the roles that Christianity fulfills for us. All of the ingredients of just a very conventional Orthodox religion exist for secularists as well as for Christians. And when we keep that in mind, we realize that this is not just a competition between the religious and the irreligious, but it's just a clash of different religions. And when we realize it's a clash of different religions, it's a clash of truth claims. And when the church realizes that there's a clash of truth claims being made, we have an obligation to get involved in those. And again, cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, because what is at stake is not political primarily. What is at stake is eternal. And when that happens, we care an awful lot.